Good morning, everybody. So this is our last morning together. So hard to believe the week has zoomed on by and we have packed it up with a whole lot of learning. So we're going to today talk about a topic that we have not really touched on yet. A little bit we have, but not only incidentally, and that is the topic of assessment. So you all took an assessment yesterday, but we need to also do that meta thinking about what is assessment? What do we mean? What are we assessing? How do we know how to assess? How do you build a good assessment? It's one of the hardest things about teaching in some ways because we will never get it exactly right. There will always be ways in which we can either improve an assessment or rethink an assessment. So there's not one right answer to that. Also, I want to apologize, but we have an expression in the US. I don't know if you have this expression here, but I have a frog in my throat. Have you heard that expression before? Yeah, is that also an expression you all know? To have a frog in my throat, it means I have to keep clearing my throat. So I apologize. I apologize to those who are watching. It will settle itself out after a minute, I'm sure. Okay, so we're going to cover a handful of things today. And I also, by the way, have a Kahoot for you in the next little, after our break. Okay, all right. So what I've put up here are a few things to get us thinking about what we mean by assessment. And I'm going to try to explain this in the best way that I know how in a very short amount of time that we have. When we do anything in any course, whether we are a student, whether we are a teacher, again, whether it's class 1 or class 4 or class 10 or university students, we have objectives. We have things we want people to be able to do. We might call those things goals. We might call them objectives. We might call them standards. These are all basically the same name for where are we heading. Knowing where we are heading gives us a purpose for what we do. So for me to even say to you today, we're going to learn about assessment and what it means. You all now know, oh, that's what we're doing today. And by the end of today, I would like you to be able to say, I can now talk about different kinds of assessment. I can now think about how to build an assessment. I can now think about when I take an assessment, what does it mean? So I have these goals, and I think of those as my guideposts. I need to kind of meander along the path and get to those guideposts. But there's a very important part of this, which is, remember I've talked about just because I teach it does not mean you learn it. Just because it's a goal doesn't mean that people have necessarily reached it. So I need to have proof that you have reached those goals, okay? That proof is in the form of some kind of an assessment. Yesterday you took an assessment that had 10 questions on it. You did not have a random question like explain the solar system, okay? If you had had a question like that, you would have said, we didn't learn that this week. Or you would have said, why does this matter? Okay? So our assessment needs to always be in alignment with our goals. Now that might seem like what we call a no-brainer. You might say, well, of course it does. There are countless times that we are expected to do something on an assessment that has not been stated on a goal or a standard. Let me give some examples of that. What if on yesterday's assessment, you all had had points taken off for sloppy handwriting? Is that one of the goals I need for you for this week? It is not. What if I had told you that you lost some points if you did not use complete sentences in your work? Is that a goal that I told you at the beginning of the week? It was not. Now I could say we're working on complete sentences this week, but I'm not. So if you wrote your answers and had no complete sentences and your handwriting was atrocious, you don't lose points for that. I might make a comment, please write more neatly next time or something like that, right? I might give some feedback. I'm not grading you, I'm not assessing you on that. So it actually happens a fair amount. Have any of you ever had an assessment? You've taken a test, exam, quiz, paper, something, where you felt that you were supposed to know something that had not actually been taught? Have you ever had an experience where you felt like you sat down and had to answer some questions or complete something that you felt that maybe a professor or a teacher hadn't actually covered very well? I mean, I think that's not an uncommon experience. The question was, had you ever had a situation where you felt that you were being assessed for something that wasn't necessarily taught? I use the example of one of my kids who needed to know their lab partners, and they lost points for not knowing the lab partners. Okay, it was never taught who the lab partners were. It was never a skill that was developed. It was never one of the end goals for the class. So to take points off for that was unfair, right? But it happens a lot, because oftentimes people building assessments are just building it off of the top of their heads, or saying, okay, well, here's what we have for your questions. Here's what you need to do to prove that you know you're learning. But what we forget is that if we do not align it with our objectives, we can solve this in two ways. We can build in an objective and then teach for it, or we can take it out of our scoring. Those are our only two choices. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that means, and I'm going to show you some examples today that I hope will help you get your head around it. When I do assessment with my teacher education candidates and my own students back home, we take a lot of time on assessment. We circle back around to it. We have at least 3 or 4 days built into the curriculum. So this is a mini version to help you just kind of think a little bit about what it means. And again, remember the meta level. You all have been assessed all of your lives. We all have been, for all sorts of things, okay? The best assessments are the ones that assess on the standards that we have been guided to learn. So let's get ourselves around that. The other thing that we're going to talk about today, and I will show you some examples of rubrics. Now, rubrics may be a new term to you. It may be a very old term. It may be a term you've known all of your life in schooling. That's fine. Rubrics can have lots of different definitions, so we'll make sure we're all on the same page about what I mean when I say rubric. When I first started going into teaching, we were not using rubrics. They weren't really a common term. And now it's a very common term in education to think about using a rubric. We're going to look at some examples. And then the standard-based learning, we're also going to look at some examples, which is just what I said. We have standards. We base all of our teaching and learning on those standards. Those standards drive everything. And if I am veering from that, then I need to either reassess the standard or reassess the pathway to get there. And again, I'm going to show you some graphic organizers, we call them, some charts. And then the last thing I want to think about briefly here, and again, I don't have time to kind of put this up like on a chalkboard or on a slide, but basically, I want you to think about what we call the toxic zero. Now, I understand that context is everything. You all have a slightly different point system for how you get scored on things, okay? So I don't want to go down a rabbit hole that is not relevant to you. What I will tell you is that in some instances, and I assume that may also be true here, but I know not to assume, we often, at least in the American system, base it on a 100-point system. So it's a percentage, okay? So you might get an 80% on something or an 85% on something. Now, I know for you all, like with the assessments we did yesterday, you had 25 points and you get so many out of 25. I don't know what happens with that 21 out of 25. I don't know if it gets converted to a percentage. I don't know whether or not it gets added in to create something that equals 100 that ends up being a percentage. So I want you to bear with me on this a little bit, because this is actually just a math problem, okay? Mathematically, when we talk about, and I'm going to talk about it in the US context, if I have a 100-point system, it's a very, very common in US schools all the way up through graduate school and beyond, that we give a percentage. And we often will give a test that has, let's say it has 25 points on it, and you got a 21 out of 25, and then I convert that to be a percentage, okay? Mathematically, just mathematically, all you need to know is basic math, okay? When I have a smaller number of items on a test, each item becomes magnified for its worth. That's just basic math. You all with me on this, right? If I have 5 items on a test and I'm converting to a percentage, you miss 1 and you're down a lot of points. The more items I have, if I had 100 items on that test and you miss 1, you're only at a 99%, right? Okay. In the United States, the system goes like this. You have an A range, which is like 90 to 100 typically. It doesn't have to be exactly that. You have a B range, which is about 80 to 90. You have a C range, which is about 70 to 80. You have a D range, which is about 60 to 70. And then you fail. You have an F. And an F is below 60, which is a full range of 60 points. So if you never submit an assignment, or if you just don't do a homework assignment one day, or several days maybe, and I put a 0 into a score sheet for you, what I've done mathematically is to completely obliterate and completely downward trend your grade, okay? A failure is 60 full points. Passing is actually only 40 points. So to put a 0 in, I call it the toxic, I didn't create that term, the toxic 0. All you need to do is Google the toxic 0 in education. What you'll find is that we do this all the time in classes. I've advocated many times for students. One of my points of advocacy is that if someone doesn't hand something in, you don't put a 0 in, you put a 50 in. Because it keeps your scale, right? So I've got, it's only another 10 points down to get a 50. Okay. Mathematically speaking, it makes a lot more sense to put a 50 in for a missing paper than a 0. And anything below a 50 is also going to, so if somebody gets a 34%, I would put that in as a 50. If somebody gets a 47%, I'd put it in as a 50, okay? There is no really good way to recover from anything below a 50 because it distorts the scale, okay? And again, you can play around with the numbers. When I teach my teacher ed candidates back home, we play around with the numbers. We pretend. We say, okay, you got this on this assignment, this on this assignment, and we play around with those numbers and see what happens, okay? So that's point number 1, toxic 0, we don't want. I had a student this past term, a college student, who did not submit an assignment, and I gave several reminders. So, well, it's late, okay, and even late points, right? Well, you're losing 5 points a day. Well, I don't tend to say that. What I say is you have until 2 days from now, and the highest mark you can get would be a B on it or something like that. Well, this student did not complete the assignment. I will not put in a 0. Again, I will put a 50% in, but that student did really well on all the rest of their work, okay? There's a big difference between not knowing anything at all and not handing it in. So I have advocated for children and youth many times where I've sat at meetings as the advocate, and a teacher has said, well, she's failing right now. And I always ask this, is that student failing because she doesn't know the material, or is she failing because she hasn't submitted the work? Those are radically different questions, right? If you're failing because you don't know the material, you need those interventions and the scaffolds to learn the material and get your work done. What is one of our fight or flight strategies? Don't do the work. It's too much for me, I'm overwhelmed, I'm just gonna ignore it. Okay, ignoring it is actually a very common thing to do. We just ignore it, it's too hard, we don't wanna face it. Okay? That's a very different matter from, I know, I just didn't have time to sit down and do it, or I don't know, I lost it in the bottom of my backpack, I thought I had done it, but I didn't. Or, oh, I was sick for a few days, can I, whatever. So there's a big difference between not having done it and not knowing the material. And how we react to that That's our very first question we should always ask if somebody is failing. Okay? And again, I understand your system may be slightly different, but you can still use the information, right? I mean, there's a difference between not knowing and not doing. Okay. So that's one thing we want to think about in assessment. Think about this for a minute. Okay, so we need to build assessments that are fair. We want to build assessments that are equitable. We want to build assessments that assess what we say they're supposed to assess. And we also want to be careful about whatever grading scheme we use, If we're using 21 out of 25, my question is, what does that mean? Is there a cutoff grade where you all of a sudden don't get credits for something? I don't know. Okay, and I can talk with Shivani ma'am more about that and find out what happens. But that would be my concern. Did anybody, for example, get a 12 out of 25? And then what does that mean? Right? I just don't know. I don't know what that means. Okay. So our 100-point system is flawed, but it's flawed in another way as well. And very often, let's take a different system, which is very similar. It's based on the 100-point system, but the system goes like this. You get an A, a B, a C, a D, or an F. So same system is all laid out there, okay, with my 100 points or whatever I have it. Now I'm grading a paper, and I very often say, oh, I don't put a 92 or a 93. I say, this is an A paper. This is a B minus. Now, I have taught for many, many, many thousands of years, okay? And 1,000 years ago, when I was first starting my teaching career, I didn't really know what an A felt like or a B felt like. But after 40 years in the business or more, I have a pretty good idea of what an A, a B, a C, and a D look like and feel like and sense like. However, if you were to come up to me and say, why did I get a C? And my answer to you is, it felt like a C. It's a little C-ish today. You would say to me, what are you talking about? It felt like a C. I say, yeah, just kind of like, you're not really beyond a C, I don't think. And you're going to say, that's so unfair. But the other thing that's really unfair about that is I might sort of feel like you're a C because you gave me some troubles. And I don't mean to hold it against you, but it kind of feels C-ish in my mind because I'm really fed up with the troubles you've given me. But I don't mean it to be unfair. I'm not an unfair person. All I mean is that you weren't here a lot of days. It's C-ish. You know, you did this or that. Oh, that's kind of a C-ish range. When I'm doing this kind of ish, I've got a problem. The problem is that everything relies on what I'm feeling in that moment, in that day. Maybe I can say, oh, I've done this for many years, I trust my expertise. Well, if I trust my expertise that much, then maybe I should have some pretty clear criteria, and I should be able to say to you, where did my C come from? And I can now say, here's the criteria, here's where you met it, and here's where you didn't, and we can talk about that, okay? So I bet all of us in this room have had experiences where we've received a mark, we call them grades, we've received a mark or a grade on something, and we've questioned it. Maybe we have felt that it wasn't fair. Maybe we have felt that it missed something we actually meant to say, or that we did say and the teacher missed it, okay? Maybe we felt that the teacher was doing something hastily in marking that. So I bet most of us have had circumstances where we felt that something was unfair in a grade. I pray that that has not been an experience for you, but it certainly has been an experience for me. We hold on to those times. Like, I can remember times, in like high school, second round, that teacher didn't give me that mark for, I hold on to it. Why am I holding on to it? Because it felt so unfair to me who had worked so hard, right? Okay, so that means that when we give these A, B, C, D marks, or whatever it is that we give, 21, whatever, we had marks very clearly set on those papers we gave you yesterday, 3 points each, and we knew in our heads, and if you ask me, where did I lose a point or two, I can tell you exactly where, because we had 3 points. If we had 10 points per question, it's going to be a lot harder for me to tell you why you got a 7 instead of a 6, right? If I have 20 points per answer, it's going to be impossible. You can say, why did you give me a 15 and not a 16? It just felt like a 15 and not a 16, right? So very often when I'm working with teachers and teachers-to-be, they will have checklists or rubrics or situations where they'll say, each item is worth 10 points. And I say, if you were in a court of law, can you tell me the difference between a 6 and a 7 on that scale? Chances are highly unlikely, okay? What if you lose 5 points for not having your lab partners listed? That's an all or nothing. You just are down 5, okay? Maybe if you list 2 of your partners, you get 2 points, whatever. But generally speaking, there are a lot of the times that we call it an all or nothing score. I'm trying to explain to you that very often assessment ends up being subjective. And it's subjective in ways that can actually really harm students in front of us. And if we believe anything about this week, we believe that we need to set up fair systems and just systems for all of our students, okay? So let's go and think about, and the other thing that I've noticed is this, that have you ever had a situation where you might have, let's say either at the college level or secondary level particularly, where you know you have, there are 2 classes that are offered in something and you get one teacher or another teacher. You say, I really hope I get that teacher because that teacher's an easier grader. Or I hope I get that teacher because that teacher gives a lot of A's or whatever it is your system is, right? Or I don't want that teacher because that teacher doesn't believe in giving A's or whatever it is, okay? What you're saying every time you say things like that is how arbitrary the system is. It shouldn't have anything to do with whether somebody gives A's or doesn't give A's or is a harder or easier grader. It shouldn't matter. What should matter is, did I set the standards? Am I assessing for the standards? And are my marks aligned with setting those standards? That's the only thing that should matter. So that teacher A and teacher B, if they're both teaching math, should have very similar grading schemas that they end up with, okay? However, we know that's not often the case. So I want people that I'm working with, say back home or with you all, to go out there and say, I don't want to be that teacher that just goes, it just felt kind of like this. Well, I don't know, I sort of feel like, and I may be justified in saying that with all of my years of experience, but you're not inside my head. So you can't plug in and say, oh yeah, I get it, all of your years of experience. What I can say is I can point to this. So I'm going to show you some examples of that. Now up here I have an acronym that's very often used to set what are our objectives and our goals, okay? And I don't know if you can read this very clearly, so I'll read it for you. They're called SMART goals. So when we set a goal for somebody, is it specific? Meaning something like, not just that your attendance is good, but that you will be, and I think some of you told me you have attendance rate, like you're supposed to be 70%, right? So that's specific. You have an exact number. Now you can play that game, you can play those marks about when you show up or don't, but the more specific I can be about a target. So let's say I want somebody to know math and I say you need to be able to get a certain mark in that, or instead of saying I want you all to be good people, maybe instead I say I want to see 3 examples of you being good, kind to somebody. Okay, so specific. And then M, measurable. What is M? I can't read that, but it's measurable. So in other words, I need to be able to measure that goal. So if it's not measurable, I shouldn't include it. So can I say, you will know 3 causes of such and such war? That's measurable. If I just say to you, just know some causes of the war, that's not measurable, okay? It should be achievable, which means that if I set something that's really out of the realm for some of my students, I've gone above the ZPD, and that's very unfair. There are times, again, that you've had things on a test that some people know and some didn't. Yesterday, somebody said, but the psych students may have an advantage over knowing some information. So if you put something on your test yesterday that was information we didn't cover in class, I wouldn't necessarily count that, because that's not, is that fair to everybody that you knew something that somebody else didn't? Not really, because it wasn't teachable, it wasn't taught, right? It's not that you did a bad thing, you might have gone above and beyond, but is it achievable by everyone in the room, and did I actually teach towards it? Because if you're just coming out with stuff that you know, that's great, I appreciate that you know it, but I shouldn't assess in that way for it. Is it relevant? And again, that's where we talk about things like, is knowing your lab partners relevant to your score on a chemistry lab? Now, you could argue that it is, but then you need to teach it, right? And it needs to be attainable, okay? And timed doesn't mean you've got 45 minutes per se. Timed is actually more about the fact that timed does not mean that the test itself is timed. I want to make this very clear. What timed means is, what we really should say here is time bound for the goal. By the end of this week, you will be able to, okay? By January, our goal is, okay? Not that it's nebulously out there somewhere forever. Timed only means this is the time we have to work on it. So I think probably a better way, instead of saying timed, would be time bound for the goal itself. That's for the goal. It is not the assessment. Is everybody clear about that? Okay. So I don't want you to mix that up. Okay, we're going to move on. And we're going to start to do some, I have plenty of examples for you that we're going to be able to look at in a minute, so that this will all pin itself down. But in the meantime, we have not really talked about Bloom's taxonomy. Has anybody ever heard of Bloom's taxonomy before? Okay, it's an education term, and actually there are variations on this. You can look up modern variations of Bloom's. You can look up, there's one called Krakau's taxonomy. There's a Bloom's that's actually been put into a circle that I really like. But for a basic beginning information about Bloom's, this is comprehension. This is cognitive domain. Remember that we're more than our cognitive domain, aren't we? We are also our affect, we are also our social emotional learning. But let's just look at our cognitive domain. Now, according to Bloom, as you go up this scale, the cognitive demand becomes greater. There's a greater cognitive demand as you go up. So Bloom broke it into lower order and higher order. I won't get into philosophy. All right, I will briefly. Why might it bother me a little bit to talk about lower and higher thinking skills in this case? Anybody know? Well, I want you to think about that. I want you to keep thinking in your heads as we go through this. Why does it need to have an issue with lower and higher order thinking skills? Just think it. Just think it. In the meantime, let's talk about what the lower ones are. So remembering. Okay, that's rote learning. That's just simply memorizing for your test. So a lot of the tests you might take might be rote learning. If they are, that's a lower level skill. It's a bottom line cognitive function. It basically is, can you memorize something? And you get rewarded for memorizing. The next one up is understanding, which really is just basically saying meaning of the materials. So if I say, what is the ZPD? And you recite back, zone of proximal development. That's recall. If I can say, what does that mean? You say, it's the zone where people learn, and below is what I already know, and above is fight or flight. That's understanding. Do you see the difference? In one case, you can memorize, and in the other, you're thinking about it a little bit more. And then you have applying. That would be me saying to you, okay, can you give me an example of something in a classroom or in the work we've had together that indicates using the ZPD? It's not something you have in your notes. You can't go through your notes and go, oh, Johnny does this, right? It's something I'm asking you to now apply the ZPD to something that you can think of in your life or in a student or whatever. Most of you, I bet, could do that right now. That's applying. The next thing is actually analyzing. So now we want to analyze it, okay? We aren't yet to evaluating and creating, but for analyzing and evaluating get very close together. You don't have to, again, am I giving you a test on this that you have to do recall? I'm not. What I'm wanting you to think about is how cognitive demand changes, okay? So analyzing would be something like looking at a child who's had these issues and say, can I not only apply it, but can I kind of analyze in there what I need to do and make it work? So it's a next level cognitive demand. You're analyzing something, you're saying, if you've ever done science and you've had data that you've looked at, okay? You're not evaluating that data yet, you're analyzing it. You're saying, what am I looking at? What is this saying? What is this kind of doing? And then comes evaluating, which is kind of like a judgment on it. What does this mean? What do I think? When I ask you to hold something up in your hands, we are evaluating in a lot of ways. We're saying, yeah, I buy that. I don't know. Does the ZPD always work for this or does it not? Or maybe I have a different way of thinking. Anita's river analogy is all right, but I'm missing some pieces to this. We're starting to evaluate. Now, that doesn't mean our opinion is always right. A higher cognitive demand asks us to prove that analysis a little bit, right? To kind of put a little bit of oomph behind your thoughts. You can't just come out with saying, I think all elephants are purple, and if I feel like that, then that's what it is. That's my opinion. Evaluating is more than that. It's actually taking what you know and kind of doing some synthesizing and trying to kind of come up with moving your learning forward. And then the last one is creating, which is really, and by the way, there are different models that actually flip some of these. Those top ones are very integrated. Actually, all of these are pretty integrated, which is why I have found a circle model that I really like, because it kind of indicates that we move in and out of these things all the time, right? When you're learning about the ZPD, so creating might be that I say to you, come up with a different metaphor of your own and see if you can get it to apply to what you're doing. Or creating might be that you're doing something that's a whole new creation from yourself that is not just applying, but in fact doing something new and different with it. So these cognitive demands go up in some essence here, right? Now, to learn about the ZPD this week, you cannot possibly have done all of that up there if you didn't do some of this. Okay, so now, why might I have a slight challenge in my head? What am I doing? And I look at this and say, I have a little challenge with this idea of lower versus higher. Can anybody tell me? Why might that kind of bother me a little bit?
Because there may be natural differences in students themselves who can and cannot do that.
Okay, so there might be, so there's an implied judgment, isn't there, right off the bat? Exactly. So there may be students that are kind of still down around this, working with this. Their brains are just as engaged. They are actually doing a lot of hard thinking, okay? You all have you've done memorization for classes before. We all have, okay? There's a lot of thinking that goes into that. Why else might it bother me to think about lower and higher? Yeah.
Already done it, like this is normal for everyone.
Yep, right.
And the higher you go, but there's a good chance that remembering might not be easy for someone, but
right.
Analyzing would be easier.
That's right, exactly. Like, aren't we kind of in a way doing all of these things? I mean, you can say, well, I can analyze that, but don't make me recite it back. Or, I'm terrible with dates and names from history, right? Like, but I can tell you all about the concepts. But I'm not, if you were to ask me the exact date of that special education law, I'd have to be like, oh, wait a minute. I know it's somewhere around. How do I know that? I know that because I remember what's happening in history around that time, right? So you're exactly right. We draw on different things depending on the information we need. So the circle model, and I don't have it up here, but I've been exploring how to think about blooms, to think about knowledge. So how does this relate to assessment? Because when I set my standards and my goals, I want to try to include a bunch of these different things. So on the assessment you took yesterday, we might have said something like, what are 3 points about the American system? That's kind of recall, maybe understanding, right? Some of these. And then I might say to you, how does that compare to your own experiences or to the Indian system? Now I'm asking you to actually apply and do a little analyzing. All right, now I didn't ask you to evaluate. I didn't say, what do you think about this? Or what do you think? We could have gone further with that. We didn't need to for that. So you can see how when I asked you to create your own rivers that you're kind of in, and we did your river exercise, you were creating. You were creating. Everybody did a different thing. What everybody had on that was completely different. They were all different. Nobody's was identical to the other. You couldn't say, can I borrow your river and can I just copy your river? Because that would be ridiculous, right? Active creation comes from the self, all right? Okay, important to remember, and if you ever are sort of stuck for where your cognitive demands are, or when you're thinking about building lessons and information. We want to try to touch on a bunch of these. What I ask my students to do is when they build their lesson plans, when they're building their assessments, can they align it with one of these pieces of Bloom's? And again, I'm not taking off if they're wrong. If they say, I think they're analyzing here, I say, I disagree. I think they're understanding. I don't do that. The point is, again, are we aware that there are multiple skills? And if all I've asked on an assessment is keeping it in these realms, or if all I'm asking is up there, then yes, I'm going to lose some students. I'm going to address some skills for some and not for others, and so on. So let's keep that in mind as we work through assessment. Okay, now I'm going to provide you with some rubrics. I don't have, this is not a very snazzy slide here, so I'm going to show you some examples, and then we're going to be able to do a couple of things together. Okay, so give me just a second here. I want to pull up. I think what I'll do, so what I want to talk about is rubrics. So I want to go to this link. Now, the nice thing about technology today is that it will do a lot of this rubric building for us. When I was first starting to work with rubrics, it was all me. I just sit down with charts and papers and my colleagues. I'm not promoting any given website. I just put in a search for free rubric maker. There are a number of them. I don't spend money on any of these things. So I liked this one, and it's free, at least at some basic level, it's free, so I'm happy with it. But I could sit down and do this by hand if I wanted to. I am not dependent on any given site. I make rubrics constantly. I really am a firm believer in a rubric system. So what is a rubric? A rubric is really just a system, a chart to help us assess according to criteria. All right. If you go back to what I started today with, which was we've got our criteria or our goals or our standards, we want to build an assessment that matches them. I want to show you some really good things about a good rubric, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and give you some examples. And I did fill one out for this class just for fun using this exact rubric maker. But let's call this, somebody give me a topic of something you either learn, not this class, let's do something else because I've got one for this class. Think about a topic you either teach or learn that is a unit or not the whole course, but just like a section of a course that you're learning about. Anybody, tell me anything you're either teaching or learning. Types of variables in research. Great, that's a great one. Variables in research. And I don't need to describe or do anything like that. And I'm not going to do maximum and minimum scores. We'll just do no score right now because I don't want to complicate. Did you notice that on that scoring it gave a maximum of 100? We're so bound by a 100-point system. A rubric, you can't do it on a rubric. So that does irritate me a bit. But let's just say, so now I would like to build a criteria. Let's see, what is this? Oh, right. Types of variables in research. What do I want students to know when they're studying variables in research? What's one of the things I think I might need to teach them?
When they're doing some research, so for me they should have some prior knowledge,
Some previous knowledge about the topic. About the topic.
I would want them to understand the function of the variable.
The function of the variables. Okay, so we've got two different things going on here. We've got some previous knowledge. No, I can't teach previous knowledge. So what am I going to do for a criteria? I might say that I would like the student to, let's change that a little bit, to build on known information. And then my next criteria is going to be, what, how did you word it again? The functions. Can we come up with one more thing we really want to make sure students know when we're working with variables? Maybe we want to actually be able to know how to...
Understanding of it, or
That's what I was thinking too. What did you say?
In the practical
use of
The practical use of the variable, okay. Which is similar in a way to function, but let's keep going with this, okay? So understand the practical okay. And then for a particular thing, I might say that you must know, you must be able to articulate a number of variables involved in whatever you're doing. Okay. Now notice my wording on these. I may need to keep changing from time to time. Now, this has a 3-point rubric. I'm going to add a column, and I'm going to call this one, I actually want the column to be, I'm going to move this column over to here, and I'm going to call this one you'll see an example of 1, 2 for this class. So when I build a rubric, this may feel to you like a brand new, like this is a lot of work. What I'm telling you is it actually is, you get it into your head how to start building rubrics, and it's really not hard to do. What it does is it helps you as the instructor or the person doing this, whatever it is you're doing with people, to help pin down really what you're looking for. And so it's much more clear. So if somebody says to me, why did I get a C, or what does this grade mean? I can point to a rubric chart very easily. Now, a 4-point rubric is actually best, and research bears this out. And the reason that a 4-point rubric is best is that if you, and this is interesting in psychology, very often we use 5-point rubrics for a Likert scale, if you're right, which is fine. In those settings, a 5-point scale actually works very well. But for a rubric, we don't want an odd number. We want an even number. And the reason is that when we grade, we have a tendency to float to the middle. Okay, and so in a Likert scale, you have enough differentiating between what each of those categories are psychologically that even if you float to the middle, you're learning some of the things there. Whereas in an assessment, you don't want an odd number, because invariably teachers and graders and so on will float to that middle. So 4 points, I've seen 6-point rubrics that work all right. I'm not a huge fan of the 6, I like the 4, but I'll explain to you why. Most rubrics that most of us use in the US now are 4-point rubrics. Now, those 4 points largely align. We're not going to start at this column, we're going to start at this column. And this column is proficient, which means where I want to start is what does it mean to actually meet this criteria. So let's fill in our chart a little bit here. So building on known information, what does it actually look like to build on prior information? What, at a basic expectation, what do I expect students to do? I expect students will note at least, or will note 2 points of prior knowledge from this course or their own experiences. Is it measurable? Yes. Is it specific? Yes. Is it attainable? Yes. Okay. I am allowing the information to come from their own experiences or from the course material that I'm teaching, okay? From there, I can now say, if you do better than that, so I can now fill this box out to say, students build in at least, or 3+ points, and so on, and I can finish that up. And then here, students note 1 point, etc. And here, students haven't been able to build on prior knowledge. No prior knowledge noted. Okay, functions of variables. We start to say, what do I expect as a bare expectation of showing me that you know this? I would say that I expect you to be able to talk about, let's say, functions of at least 3 of the variables, and so on. Okay, now again, because I'm not teaching that class, I can't pop it in. I'll show you an example from this class in a minute. But the point is, I start here, which is my meeting. You're meeting the expectation. You are proficient. Okay, that means you've passed. You're doing fine. Okay, here you're partially meeting. You're getting there. Okay, you're doing what we might call emerging, like a butterfly coming out of its cocoon. Okay, or its chrysalis. Here you really are kind of having some issues and some challenges, but you tried. We have something we can base a rubric on. And here you've gone above and beyond in some way, or done something sort of extra or exceptional. Okay. A 4-point rubric, sort of ish, can match with it. I always tell my students, if you don't know where you fall on this, so we normally put a number here. That'll be a 4, a 3, a 2, and a 1. And I start with the 4 in this column because as you're coming out of the criteria, this is the best you can be, and then it goes down to here. So 4, 3, 2, 1 largely aligns with an A, B, C, D, except now I have proof as to why. You say, why did I get a B-? Well, because you did this, 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 and this, right? So now I can kind of do my numbers. There is one huge caution that I continue to see happening when teachers use rubrics. A rubric score is never a percentage. It is never a percentage. In a way, this rubric automatically builds in starting at a 50%, if you want to think of it that way, okay? Or it actually builds in more like a 60%. Let me show you why. Let's say you are proficient. You've done everything I've asked you to do, and you get a 3, a 3, a 3, and a 3. If I use percentages, that's 75%, which in an American system is a C. But in fact, you've really earned a good solid B range. So you're actually, a rubric translated to a percentage will always harm a student. The only time it doesn't harm a student is if they're all A's and then they get 100%, which benefits them. Okay, so all of a sudden I've got a student who did all of this and a student that did all of this, and if I translate to a percentage, I've really harmed almost all of my students in my class. I've seen teachers do this over and over and over again. When my own kids were growing up, they'd bring back their work, they'd say, well, I didn't do very well on this, I got a C, and I'd look at it and I'd say, no, you didn't. Your rubric score shows that you actually came out in a B range. So then I'd go and I'd talk with the teacher and I'd say, rubric scores don't get translated into percentages, okay? Again, it's just simple math, all right? Here, even if you got all of this down, you're not at a 0. And you're not even at a 25%. You're at more like a D range, which I'd put you in at maybe a 6. You tried, you did something, we've got to keep working on it. So our school systems in the US, a handful of years ago, largely shifted to using 4-point rubrics because 4 points makes a whole lot more sense than 100 points, or even than 25 points, right? So if I say, do you know the difference between a 9 and a 10 on a 10-point answer, you cannot say that you do. But if I tell you, do you know the difference between a 1 and a 2, yes, you do. So I one time heard somebody use the analogy, this is not my analogy, it's that you have a candy bar, just a regular-sized candy bar, okay? And that candy bar is divided into 100 pieces. Think of how tiny. Okay, I've only got to 50 and I'm halfway. Think of a candy bar split into 100 pieces. It's just like crumbs, right? I scoosh a few crumbs this way and I scoosh a few crumbs this way. And you say to me, wait a minute, did you scoosh 20 crumbs or was that 23 crumbs? I have absolutely no idea. I've just scooshed some crumbs. But if I have a candy bar and I say, can we break it into 4 pieces? Yeah, I've got that pretty clear. So a 4-point rubric is very clear. And it sets your criteria, and it's a whole lot easier for me to say, you've got a quarter of that candy bar. You've got a half of that candy bar. You've got 3/4 of the candy bar. You've got the whole candy bar. In no circumstance do you fail to have any part of that if you've tried, if you've put something down where we're working with you, okay? All right, so a rubric is something I actually really like. Now, I started today by saying there's no such thing as a perfect assessment. Rubrics have plenty of challenges, but I much prefer to use a rubric. I use rubrics when I grade students. I use rubrics all the time. I can show you examples of ones that I use. I just build them out. Sometimes I use a more generic one, but very often I apply it to the class. So let me show you the one, a sample that I did. Right here. Okay. Let's take a look at what I did for our class. I don't know how clear this is to you. I think you all can read this all right. Here's what I did using the exact rubric maker that I just showed you, okay? Let's start in this column. Remember, we're starting in what I would call kind of the B range column, or the you are meeting. How do I know that you've left this week meeting what I want you to leave this week with? Okay, I have certain things. Shivani, ma'am, and I have certain things we want. Can you articulate? Notice how clear that is. Not just, can you say, it's not just a nebulous thing. It's the student can articulate key elements of the purposes and history of educational movements in India and the US. Can you just give me some basic historical information? Okay, if you can do that pretty well, and here's what can you give 3 elements from each country and make 1 to 2 comparisons? Guess what you had a question on yesterday? It wasn't exactly this, but you see what I'm saying, right? Can you give at least 4? Then you're going to get even a higher grade. Can you give 2 elements? You may struggle to make those comparisons, but you got some elements in there, right? And then can you only give 1, or maybe you just couldn't make the connections at all? Then maybe you just get a 1. So that's a 1, a 2, a 3, and a 4, okay? Now again, this doesn't work perfectly in thinking about our papers yesterday because those were 3-point answers and so on. So it's an imperfect comparison. What I'm trying to do is help you get your head around thinking about what we mean when we assess. So another one, can you name some key people in education? So, and I even put some examples here, Tagore, Dewey, Mann, Piaget, Vygotsky, right? Some of these names starting to ring a bell that you maybe didn't know before, or maybe you did know and you hadn't really thought about it. Can you name 3 and give a couple of sentences about their contribution? Can you name at least 4 and explain their contributions? Can you name 2 and give a little bit about, or can you name 1 and maybe don't note their contributions? Now, what if you have somebody that can name 5 but don't ever mention their contributions? That's where rubrics can get very tricky, because now they've exceeded on one of these. So you should never put too much into this. You don't want to have too many things because you can really get yourself down a rabbit hole that you can't get out of. All right, can you identify some key theories of education? Okay, and again, and so forth. Can you define, explain, and note the benefits of inclusive education for various subgroups? Now, I stopped there, but I could have kept going. I mean, we had more. I could have put an assessment piece on here. What I'm showing you is I used that rubric to fill this out. We did not use this rubric for you, but I play around with rubrics all the time because I want to ask myself, have I set a clear goal? Do I have a measurable thing you can reach? So if I just said some, so another flaw to rubrics is sometimes somebody says, can name some elements, can name a lot of elements, can name a few elements. What is it? Your sum may look like my many, right? So I put an actual number. Okay, is it measurable? Is it smart? Does it meet all of those SMART criteria? Okay. And I could say, if I want it to be that time-bound one, I could say by the end of this week, students will be able to do this. Okay. So take a breath. I want you to think about what I've said about rubrics and rubric building. You may not be in a situation where you ever build a rubric. You may not be in a situation where you ever receive a rubric. But I will tell you that we use rubrics. I will show you an example we're hiring somebody to come in for a visiting professor for next year in our department. So we sat down and we built a rubric. And we did not actually put it as the same exact form that you just saw, but we sat down together as a department. We created this. It didn't exist before. We just were looking at this saying, well, we want them to have some qualifications. We want them to have a terminal degree in education or a related field. Usually that means a PhD or an EDD. We want them to have specialty areas that support our education minors. We want them to have experience working with children and youth in a public school. Remember, that for us means government school setting. So we really want whoever's coming in to have experience working in our government schools, and does not significantly overlap with Bronwyn or Anita's work, because we're the ones that are also going to be there. We don't want too much overlap with our work. Okay, and then we go on. We have a bunch of criteria. We have some evidence. Okay, is it measurable? If I just think, I don't know, maybe they like kids, maybe they don't, that's not evidence, right? So I have to have evidence. Do we have, and notice that this is kind of like a 4, 3, 2, 1, isn't it? It's like, cannot evaluate, minimal, adequate, abundant, right? So loads of evidence of the work they've done with children in public schools, okay? Loads. Here's one that's maybe, the next candidate has some. Next candidate, I actually don't see, I don't see anything there, so I just have to put this. Do you notice it's a 4-point rubric with evidence, and then any additional notes just in case I may be off or not thinking in the same way as one of my colleagues. When there were 3 of us that came together to look through, we were so closely aligned. Do you know why? Because this was measurable, because we could prove it, because we could put our finger onto it and say, notice this right here. And we could do the same for all of these. Teaching, look at this, commitment to inclusive pedagogy. What have we learned about this week? Commitment to undergraduate teaching and mentorship in a liberal arts context. That's important for us in what we do. So if somebody comes out of a very large university that maybe they're working with PhD students, that's kind of minimal evidence that they could maybe transfer that to our setting, all right? Potential to teach our beginning class and some electives, ability to advise students. We want to make sure that doesn't always come through, but maybe in a letter of recommendation or in a cover letter, they say, I've done a lot of advising of students, so the evidence is here, and I can mark it here, okay? And so on. Experience working with historically underrepresented first generation and marginalized student populations. We have that as a commitment, a #1 commitment. So if our candidate cannot do this, they're going to end up with some lower scores, okay? We had 87 applicants, which for you might seem like not a lot. I don't know in the Indian system if you have 300, but I will tell you that for us, that was a lot of applicants. We filled this out for 87 applicants, okay? But because we had the rubric, we could go through it pretty well and talk about it together. And then did they have their components? And to be honest, this was either yes or no. This is just they've got what they were told to submit, okay? They either have a cover letter or they don't. They either have a resume or they don't, CV, okay? So those weren't really scored in the same way. And then yes, we wanted to invite them to a Zoom interview. Maybe we do, and no, we really just don't see enough evidence, okay? So a good use of a rubric. What I'm trying to say is you may not use rubrics in a classroom in the same way. You may be trying to make a decision about something. You can set up what your criteria are. You set up a scale. You can set it up however you want to, okay? So using a rubric pins you down, and it keeps your criteria very clear, okay? So there's an example. Does that make sense? Are you all with me on this? Okay. Hang in there because we can see if I have any other. So that's quick rubric. Here's a holistic one. I did it as a bullet point. I'm not a big fan of kind of really showing you this one, but basically in an A presentation, which I could say for a 4, you can't read this, but it basically says make eye contact, posture, and so on, if possible. So if somebody can't make eye contact, like my daughter who's visually impaired, she can't make eye contact, you don't mark her down for it because it's if possible. You can't mark somebody down for something they are unable to do, right? And so on. Delivers in a loud, clear voice. I mean, so anyway, it's basically the same thing. We just have it in a bullet format here instead of the other. Okay. So let's I will get out of that. Let's kind of just shake it out a little bit here. I'm going to get out of this one. And we're going to take a little bit of a break for a minute. And then we're going to come back around and I'm going to show you some lesson plan templates. And then we'll play a game and we'll kind of shake it out. Okay, so take a couple of minutes. Is this all right to do that right now? 20? Okay, it's a good marking spot. But just to kind of settle before we break, what I want you to think about is assessing needs to match your criteria. And the best way to do that is to be crystal clear about what each thing matches. So whether you're working in psychology, whether you're working with students, whether you're in a job that asks you to make some decisions, rubrics can be used for anything. And they are really a sharp tool. Okay, they are not perfect. They are not perfect. There are a lot of flaws in a rubric, but I prefer them over a lot of other kinds of assessing. Okay, I actually think the way we did the assessment yesterday works out very well. It was very clear. 3 points isn't 10, right? 3 points adds up and you get your score. All right, so I don't know how that translates, but I think that works pretty well. It's a similar thing in a way. I could have sat down and done a rubric for that and it would have worked out pretty well. Okay. All right, let's take a minute, let's shake it out, give you 10 or 15 minutes, and we'll come back around, say at 11:05.